I went to college and then went to seminary. Seminary is graduate school for people studying for the ministry. And so I earned a Master's of Divinity, where I took, the Greek and the Hebrew and theology, church history, took pastoral ministry class, where you learn how to baptize somebody without drowning them. Some classes on, preaching, church administration, just lots of stuff like that. Some practically oriented classes and more academically oriented. Then I stayed in seminary and did a PhD in Old Testament and Hebrew. So there's something very interesting. The school I was at had a building with the professor's offices, then a building with the classrooms, and of course a library building and a chapel, and a cafeteria and things like that. So in the building with professors' offices, there was one room downstairs that was the examination room. And it had one of these big giant tables with chairs around it, and had a fireplace with a mantle on the fireplace. And so halfway through the doctoral program, we had to take 3 days of written exams in order to continue. So I'd passed those. And then once you finished all of your coursework, you have to take a 2-hour oral exam. Then you can, if you pass that, then you can write your dissertation. And once you have finished your dissertation, then you have an oral defense where you have to go in and have a meeting with your PhD committee where they grill you and ask questions about your dissertation. If you pass that, then you get your degree and become Dr. Smith. What's interesting is that the room where the oral exams took place and the room where the defense of the dissertation take place are in that examination room. And on that mantle above the fireplace, there's a Bible, at least it was in those days. And it was an open Bible. And the Bible was opened to the book of Lamentations. I don't know if a student did that. I don't know if it was, nobody realized it. I don't know if the professors did it. But I can guarantee you there was a lot of lamenting that went on in that room over the years. There were many a student who did not pass their oral exams, had to come back after more study and try them again. There were some students that passed, but man, it was a challenge. As a matter of fact, for the oral exams, what they did was they would ask you a question, like discuss the process of archaeology. And so, originally it was just pick some stuff off the surface, then develop the Wheeler-Kenyon method. Okay, thank you. Like they would just cut you off. We know he knows that subject. So then they move on to the next one. Like discuss the upper and lower chronology of the dating of the book of Jeremiah. So you start to answer that. Okay, thank you. And they just are looking for what you don't know. And so it is very stressful. And then it ends with open your Hebrew Bible and start reading. And we'll just pick a passage. And so they'd pick one and I'd say start reading and translating. And then they would ask questions about it. So there was a lot of lamenting went on. And then there were many that failed their dissertation the first time. It was, actually, it's fairly common to have to do some pretty significant edits. I was one of those that had to do that. So there was a lot of lamenting in that room. So I give that story because I want to talk about, you guessed it, the book of Lamentations on this week's Theology Thursday. So the book of Lamentations was written by Jeremiah. That's why in the English Bible it follows the book of Jeremiah. In the Hebrew Bible it's located in another section where we have 5 scrolls, one for each of the 5 festivals. And Lamentations is the scroll that's read during the remembrance of the 9th of Av, which was the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. So in 586, the Babylonians destroy the city of Jerusalem, destroy the temple, capture Zedekiah trying to escape, execute his sons, and poke his eyes out so that he, last thing he ever saw was the execution of his sons. Jeremiah was spared because the Babylonians knew he had encouraged the people to surrender in order to save the city. And that was a part of God's message. So after the destruction of the city, Jeremiah is going to write this book lamenting the loss of life, the destruction of the beautiful city, the end of the temple, and the sacrifices and all of that. But there's something very interesting about Lamentations, and that is the structure. So Hebrew poetry doesn't have rhyme and doesn't have meter. It's based on just 2 parallel lines. You can have a short line, a really long line, but they parallel one another, either saying the same thing or opposites. There is an exception to that. There's one kind of poetry that actually has a very specific meter, and it's called a kenah form, after the Hebrew word kenah, and it's 3 and 2, 3 and 2, 3 and 2, or kina means to kind of to limp, and it's the image of carrying a casket, and you don't walk evenly as you carry the casket, and so it's called the funeral dirge or the funeral meter, this kina form. The entire book of Lamentations is written in that, which would make perfect sense. So that's the first thing. The second thing about the book of Lamentations is it has a very fascinating structure. So if you'll notice, there are 22 verses. If you look at it, there are 22 verses in chapter 1. There are 22 verses in chapter 2. Chapter 3 has 66 verses. Chapter 4 has 22, and chapter 5 has 22. You may be asking, okay, so why is that significant? Well, in Hebrew, there are 22 letters in the alphabet. So chapter 1 is an acrostic. So the first verse begins with the first Hebrew letter, Aleph. Verse 2 begins with Beth, the second letter, and so on through all 22 letters. In English, it would be A, B, C, D, and we'd have 26, go through all A through Z. And so the book is arranged with a very specific meter, and there's an acrostic, A through Z, so to speak. Chapter 2 has 22 verses, and yes, you guessed it, it's an acrostic. Goes through all the letters in order. Chapter 3 has 66 verses. So we have 3 verses with the first letter, 3 verses with the second letter, 3 with the third. That's why we have 66. So the middle chapter, chapter 3, is a very extended acrostic. 3 verses for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Then chapter 4 is 22 verses, and yes, it is an acrostic. And chapter 5 has, if you're looking at it, 22 verses. And no, chapter 5 is not an acrostic. There are some who've tried to rearrange it and rewrite it to make it an acrostic, but it is not. And I think there's a reason. And here's the reason. Grief is a process. Normal life is not. It's more random. So the structure of Jeremiah tells us that you and I, when we have suffered great loss and tragedy, go through the process. You and I need to give people who have suffered a great loss time to work. We even use this phrase, work through their grief. Lamentations works through the alphabet to show that we work through our grief. But you can't live there forever. At some point, we come out on the other side, and life kind of picks up again. So we kind of, taken a time out, paused life to deal with our grief, and now we're ready to move on where life is a little more random, like chapter 5. And so Lamentations is a great, just the way it's laid out is a great description of what it's like to go through the process of grief and loss. Very instructive for us, for ourselves. We need to take time to process grief, but also in terms of ministering to other people. Don't expect us to bounce back immediately. Time is needed. Companies realize this. Most companies have some kind of bereavement policy where you're allowed time off for the loss of a loved one. When we understand this, you need some time. So that's the structure. The Kina form tells us a lot. It's a funeral dirge. It's about lamenting. Lamenting, mourning, grieving is a process. But also we come out on the other side at some point and resume life again. It may be different than it was before. It will be different than it was before because someone's now gone. There is a loss. But we're back to living life now. There's kind of a different normal than was before, kind of a new normal. But life kind of resumes a little more normalcy. But there's another thing about Lamentations that's really interesting, and that is actually in chapter 3. So we're here in life, and then we suffer a tragedy and loss, and now we're going through the grieving process. But you can't just keep going down, nor can you get to the bottom and stay on the bottom. We come down, we hit the bottom, and at some point we need to turn the corner and start back up again. That's the way that it works. And then we come out on this side with this was normal. We have the grieving process. Now we're back to a new normal, but it's still some kind of living life normally sort of thing. So in chapter 3, he's going to make this statement. I'm just going to start in verse 16. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. That's just a horrible description, like chewing gravel. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished, So has my hope from the Lord. There's no more lower level than I have no hope. My hope is gone. It has perished from the Lord. In verse 19, the very next verse says, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. Like he says, I'm at the very bottom. But, verse 21, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. So in verse 18, my hope is perished from the Lord. Verse 21, I have hope because something has come to my mind. There's something in the very darkest place, there's still a light that shines. And what is that? Next verse, verse 22. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. There was a song based on this. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Great is thy faithfulness. It comes out of the King James. It's a great classic hymn. It comes right out of this. So Jeremiah has gone through this grieving process. We're almost to the middle point of the book. He's at the bottom. He says, but now I turn the corner. Because I remember, no matter how bad it gets, the Lord's mercies are new every morning. God's faithfulness to me is great. His steadfast love never ends. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. Now, we go a few more verses, and he's lamenting again. In other words, you don't hit the bottom and then jump. We're now working our way out. There are going to be more positive statements, but there's still grieving to be done. And so we see, but I love the way the book of Lamentations is laid out. This funeral kind of poetry, the acrostics working through grief. Chapter 5, non-acrostic. Now life has resumed itself again. We've kind of taken this break in order to work through our grief. But boy, this middle, right in the middle, at the very bottom, my hope is perished from the Lord, then this I call to mind. That the steadfast love of the Lord never ends. His mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Therefore I have hope. So if you know someone going through a loss, give them time to grieve. But also remind them of the great faithfulness of our Lord, of his steadfast love and his mercies. If you're going through a time of grief, or at some point in the future you do, turn to the book of Lamentations. Weep with Jeremiah. Mourn and grieve with Jeremiah. But when you're at the bottom, remember that with Jesus, the bottom is rock solid. And recall this to mind. The steadfast love of the Lord does not end. Great is your faithfulness. So I hope this brings you some encouragement, even out of the book of mourning, out of the book of Lamentations. Everybody, in Bible times, in modern times, and all the way till the end of time, everybody's going to suffer loss and mourning and sorrow. Take time to grieve, but don't ever forget how great is the faithfulness of our God. God bless you. I hope you have a great day today.